Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John V. has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining me on an analytical session on the Gilded Age, which, of course, on January 20th, on the inauguration date of President Donald Trump, he announced that the United States was entering a new golden age. Many analysts, journalists, scholars interpreted that to mean, of course, a Gilded Age. Gilded Age was basically the last one quarter of the 19th century, roughly from the end of the Civil War to the to 1900 to 1920 is known as the Progressive Era in American history. Gilded Age was the name that was given to this era by the famous humorist literary figure Mark Twain and his co-author Charles Dudley in a book they titled by that same name. It was a satire, of course, intended to criticize a society in which projected the appearance of a golden age, just like the president of the United States is endeavored to project the same appearance of a golden age in America, a country with 12% population below the poverty line. So Mark Twain, Charles Dudley called it the Gilded Age because everything that appeared on the surface to be golden was actually just beneath the surface, corrupt, decadent, rottenness, and we'll see analytically this was the age that there was, in fact, lingering institutionalized racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and so forth that lasted decades thereafter. Many historians and political scientists, social critics, and so forth labeled the period of neoliberalism from the institutionalization of neoliberalism from the presidency of Ronald Reagan to the present a new Gilded Age. Neoliberalism, of course, is not to be confused with liberalism. Neoliberalism is a political economy, the philosophy of political economy that stresses the hegemony of the market over all of societal institutions, including the state, and it, in fact, invites, contrary to classical laissez-faire theory of Adam Smith, neoliberal philosophy, neoliberal economics invites the role of the state to buttress the private sector in the form of corporate subsidies, lower tax rates for the wealthy, placing a larger burden, fiscal burden, tax burden on the mass consumer, privatizing public property to give it to the to businesses, strengthening the corporate sector, amassing capital at the very top. And the question, of course, is how is all this related to the Gilded Age? In the Gilded Age, there were approximately 4,000 millionaires who actually controlled the institutional network, both private and public, that from everything from newspapers to the to judges, to local government, mayors, politicians at the federal level. So they enjoyed dominance in society. That kind of dominance, institutional dominance of an oligarchy, is present today, as former President Joseph Biden said on his way out of the White House in his farewell address, that indeed America is ruled by an oligarchy. And this has been repeated since he said it by many politicians in Washington, obviously from the Democratic Party. Many politicians have said the exact same thing, that there is an oligarchic rule. And then, of course, newspapers and online magazines and so forth have repeated this. There are interesting parallels between the Gilded Age, the classical Gilded Age, and Trump's Golden Age, which is, of course, the new Gilded Age. The Gilded Age coincided with the American industrialization of the economy. This was the period when the United States was rapidly industrializing, having finished the Civil War in 1865, and simultaneously undertaking two things. One was the westward expansion, obviously at the expense of the Native Americans, regimenting them in reservations, okay? And the other was the undertaking of, especially in the southern states, of passing state by state, passing black codes and Jim Crow laws, as they're called, namely laws intended all to marginalize the African American population that was newly freed. So, in other words, to more or less institutionalize racism. Obviously, this meant the permanence of segregation until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. This was the practice. So there is a reason why I'm mentioning it, all of this is because the Trump administration came in with the world's richest individual, Elon Musk, whom Trump appointed to head the government, the ad hoc group called Doggy Government Efficiency Group, basically a group that is designed to do away with diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. In other words, what we used to call affirmative action, especially in academia where I worked for decades, the so-called affirmative action measures, which were institutionalized in the private sector, and the private sector adopted them, went out of the window. The interesting thing about all of this, by the way, is that the government, in gutting many agencies, federal agencies, and the Trump administration has mentioned that it wants to do it at the level of 50%, and in dismantling others like USAID and giving jurisdiction to the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. In doing all of this, the fact is that the Trump administration has invoked informally unitary executive theory. In case you don't know what that is, this is unconstitutional. Unitary executive theory implies that the executive branch is hegemonic in government. It does not respect the separation and division of the branches of government is the fact that the Congress of the United States has jurisdiction over the federal agencies, funds the federal agencies, and that's how the founding fathers intended it. Apparently does not mean much. In fact, on February 15, 2025, the President of the United States posted something on Elon Musk's X social media, formerly Twitter, and I quote, this is, by the way, taken from the French Emperor Napoleon. He's the one who actually said this, and Trump copied it. He who saves his country does not violate the law. Now, what does this mean? Trump is out to save the country. What did Napoleon mean? The same thing. Who decided during Napoleon's time what constituted saving the country? Napoleon did. Who decides now? Trump does. This is a violation of the US Constitution, which established the legislative branch of government as the dominant branch of government. This is based on the philosophy of the English thinker John Locke, who wrote during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson, rested heavily on Locke, as well as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French social democrat thinker, to draft the Constitution. And the delicate balance of power and the division and separation of powers in government, obviously, has been very important in order to maintain the liberal democracy that the United States has been since the founding fathers, since the late 18th century, the era of the Enlightenment. This new Gilded Age is reactionary. The word reactionary, by the way, it can have a couple of different meanings. In politics, the word reactionary means someone who is not interested in conserving. Conservative is someone who wants to conserve the status quo. A reactionary is someone who wants to go back in time. How far back do these people, the GOP and this particular president, want to go? They're going to go back to the Gilded Age. The president announced it, that he's interested in going back to the gold. He's interested in bringing the Golden Age, by which he meant Gilded Age, because he mentioned specifically President William McKinley, who was part of the Gilded Age and who was an economic nationalist, whom Trump is trying to emulate. McKinley, while a congressman, actually passed the McKinley tariff, which was a disaster, and it actually made worse the economic depression of the 1890s. Just as a history lesson, the McKinley tariff, which of course now it's romanticized because we're in the era of tariffs, actually made much worse the economic contraction of the 1890s. The United States economy suffered very deeply, and the way that McKinley found to get out of that contracting cycle of the economy was to build a massive navy and military force. Actually, he started in the late 80s and he just continued it, and to go to war against Spain and to have the United States become an imperialist country, seizing a number of territories from the Philippines, the Hawaiian Islands, to informally, of course, semi-colonize Cuba, reduce it to an economic colony, but not a formal colony. The Philippines was a formal colony. And of course, take Puerto Rico in the process and establish a foothold in Central America. That's when the Panama Canal issue started, by the way. The Panama Canal issue is really an outgrowth of the Spanish-American War. And Panama did not exist, by the way. Panama was just a province of Colombia. The U.S. had some local rebels with the help of the United States Navy uh, declare independence, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers decided um, to have the canal there because it facilitated the U.S. Navy and, of course, the merchant fleet to go through there into the Pacific instead of going all the way around. So this is Trump's model, the Gilded Age, although he, of course, said the Golden Age. Now, I should point out that there are some very striking differences before I get into some details between the classical Gilded Age and the new Gilded Age. Trump's Golden Age, which is the new Gilded Age. During the classical Gilded Age, Mark Twain's era of, but by the way, it's also called the era of materialism, the era of imperialism, the era of nationalism, the era of social Darwinism, which implies white supremacy, and there was plenty of that in the United States in a segregated society, by the way. One difference between the Gilded Age and there are many, one between the Gilded Age and the new Gilded Age, the Gilded Age of the 19th century and the one of the 21st century, is that the old Gilded Age, the late 19th century Gilded Age, was the era of industrial expansion and the era of mass inclusion into the economy of banks. The role of banks became very important. In fact, economists call this the era of finance capitalism. So industrial capitalism gave way to finance capitalism. The United States, during the late 19th century, was struggling to become an industrialized country, join the great powers. There were no superpowers back then. Great powers, namely Western Europe and Japan, was industrializing around the same time as the United States. So the other great power was, of course, Japan. The other similarity is that the other rather interesting feature about the classical Gilded Age was that the Gilded Age was a precursor to what is called in American history Pax Americana, the American peace, the empire, the imperial hegemony that the U.S. Has come to exercise, especially in the post-World War II period. This is the period when the foundation for imperial hegemony was established. So the period of the classical Gilded Age, the 19th century Gilded Age, is when the U.S. was on the ascendancy, upward trend. It was, and despite of, by the way, marginalization of minorities, Indians, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Southern and Eastern Europeans. This was a country, by the way, for Northwest Europeans, white Protestants. That's about it. Even Catholics were frowned upon. So you have basically a very narrow group in the elite institutions of the country, including the government, by the way. However, it held the promise, precisely because of industrialization, that there was a better tomorrow. So just hold on, and your children will have a better tomorrow. They'll move into the middle class, perhaps in the lower middle class, because this was the period also when the United States was building many educational institutions, including many colleges and universities, because the industrial economy required an educated workforce. So this is another interesting feature. And the last one I'm going to mention, there are others. The last one I'm going to mention about the classical Gilded Age, the Gilded Age of Mark Twain, is this was the period when the gold standard was very important. There was a debate among politicians whether there should be a gold standard, whether it should be gold and silver, and so forth. Today, we're not in a gold standard. We are in a financialization crypto economic system. In fact, the financialization of the economy under the neoliberal political model entails massive speculation, and cryptocurrencies are a part of this, whether it is in the United States or in Argentina. And I'm mentioning Argentina because just recently they had a huge problem with crypto coins. So the economy of the United States today is not resting in the new Gilded Age on the secondary sector of production, on the manufacturing sector. It rests on financialization, namely speculation on the value of the stock market, literally on an hourly basis. So it's the value of the economy and wealth is, and obviously technology has made this possible to a large degree, but it's the model of the neoliberalism that is at the core. It is really based on speculating on the fluctuating prices of stocks. So the real economy, the secondary sector of production, which is manufacturing, the primary, which is mining, forestry, fisheries, agriculture, is all subject to financialization. That is, there is speculation on those as well. So the middlemen, the parasitic middlemen speculating on this are the ones making money. Rather than the people on the ground. The most money is made by the speculators. The question, of course, is how well has this served the American economy? The results speak for themselves, considering the United States has now taken a back seat to China, which is the world's largest manufacturing country, and the United States is struggling in all sorts of ways to stop China from moving farther ahead and to catch up with China through sanctions, through tariffs, through all kinds of means, through military intimidation and so forth, containment policy, as we'll see. The Mark Twain era of Gilded Age is the era of robber barons, as it was called. And many scholars today argue that we are in probably somewhat the same situation with the robber barons that Bernie Sanders called the high-tech the Silicon Valley oligarchs. Actually, there is the billionaire class again, as many critics call it, including the senator from Vermont, the billionaire class that has an inordinate influence in government policy and institutional-wide influence, because many of these people are behind the mainstream media and the social media. Obviously, these are the people who own it. However, they're also influential because they are the ones who sit on university boards or have influence in university boards. So they control the boards of trustees, because the major universities in the United States depend on endowments. So they have veered the course of colleges and universities to the neoliberal model. This starts with Reagan, by the way, and it continues to this day, and it has gotten much tighter to this day, considering the stronghold that the new robber barons, the oligarchy, as Joe Biden calls them, have on society, on the institutional structure. So the foundation of all this is Wall Street. In the classical Gilded Age, in the 19th century, of course, there were roughly, as I said, 4,000 people that owned more than 20% of the wealth. This was a period when these people had control of railroads, of oil, of steel, banking. These are the people who own the major sectors in the economy. They opposed regulation. They opposed unionization. They opposed the right of women to vote. They did not want popular democracy in society because that meant accountability. They remain in today's counterparts opposed to public accountability. So what we have is the Gilded Age, when there was enormous corruption because these very wealthy individuals had with their money the influence to determine the political course from the local level to the state level to the federal level. So this was the period of very tight control by a few thousand of the wealthiest individuals. It is not so different today. In fact, it's very similar. Those of you who watched President Trump, you saw billionaires behind him, namely from Silicon Valley. It is no secret that it takes billions of dollars to run campaigns for the entirety of U.S. Senate, U.S. House of Representatives, and the presidency of the United States. Ordinary people don't have billions, don't have that kind of money to provide. The bulk of the money comes from billionaires and multimillionaires and from corporations and big banks. Therefore, the political class is beholden to the business class. And the question is, what does this mean in terms of policy? Today, the same thing it meant in the Gilded Age, that the state is a vehicle which determines policy and determines social engineering to a large degree, and it is a vehicle for income redistribution through fiscal policy, monetary policy, labor policy, investment policy, trade policy. So the state is really a mechanism behind which are, in this, by the way, in this day and age with President Trump in the White House, it's not even from behind the scenes. In the 19th century, by the way, a lot of these people were too shy. The Rockefeller family wasn't that shy, but a lot of these people were too shy to be in the spotlight, and they were wielding power from behind the scenes, and the politicians were in the forefront, really governing on their behalf, conducting public policy on their behalf. Today, you have the world's richest man, you would think, instead of hiding out, who is in the forefront of this, placing himself in the forefront and subject to scrutiny, not necessarily so much by the mainstream media as by independent critics and independent media sources. And of course, all these people have enemies within their own class, by the way, as well as outside. So what we have is the business class using the state as an instrument to redistribute income to itself, back to itself. So that role hasn't changed, by the way. In classical economics, those of you who have studied it, you know this is the role of the state, and it does it through various channels from, like I said, fiscal policy, monetary policy, labor policy, investment policy, trade policy. So the state has various mechanisms that it has used historically, and especially today under neoliberalism, with all the emphasis on deregulation. Now, here's another, since I mentioned deregulation, here's another domain, another area where the new Gilded Age has a lot in common with the old Gilded Age. The new Gilded Age wants as little regulation as possible. One of the goals of the Trump administration in putting out there the world's richest individual to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion, namely Elon Musk, in the federal agencies, is because some of those are involved in regulatory measures, imposing regulatory measures. Let's take, for example, one they really hate, and that is the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which, by the way, was a Republican creation. Nixon created that. In any event, or the Department of Human Services, they want to dismantle that. USAID, which Kennedy created, that is mystifying to me, because actually that's an instrument that serves U.S. imperialist interests and corporate interests. But they, but it does provide. It did provide, and it used to provide the humanitarian services, no more, on a world scale, in order to promote pro-U.S. sentiment worldwide. Considering the U.S., by the way, there are about 195 countries in the world. The U.S. has a military presence in one form or another in 175 of those countries. And so here was an agency, even the Chinese were onto this, and they're trying to fill in the gap now that the USAID was dismantled effectively. Promoting, basically, it was propaganda instrument. It was involved in all sorts of things, from feeding the press information to, there are allegations of bribery. Oh, yes, they transferred money here and there, but that's, that's part of the thing, of the game. It was a Cold War agency. Kennedy created it after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, of course, yes, but it was also serving humanitarian needs worldwide. By the way, a budget of about 40 billion or so. In the grand scheme of things, of close to $7 trillion budget in the U.S. budget, this is a drop in the bucket. In any case, the Trump administration, in promulgating the new Gilded Age, or Golden Ages, of course he calls it, and the group, the whole Trump administration group, not just Trump, but all of them, want to inculcate into the public that the new norm is deregulation. It is dismantling a number of the agencies, by the way. It is reducing the labor force in many others, which agencies, by the way, were created. Many of these, the genesis of this was during another Republican administration. Theodore Roosevelt, elected in 1900, took over in 1901. He started creating this. Big business made it necessary for the creation of a big federal bureaucracy to serve back big business. Many of these were there to serve big business, by the way. Free of service, the taxpayer picked up the bill. Now, why is the Trump administration doing this? Various reasons. One reason is, well, it operates on affirmative action, namely diversity, equity, inclusion. Yes, it does, because the fact is, we have to remember that up until the Civil Rights Act, the United States operated on black codes and Jim Crow laws, and there was institutional racism in the United States. There's no reality. There is no doubt about that reality, by the way. Universities, public and private, would not hire black professors, okay, using merit as a pretext. Okay. Businesses would not hire blacks. They would, when they did, they paid them a great deal less. So the same thing with women. The era of the Gilded Age was also an era that did not want to provide women with equal rights, the right to vote, for example. Simple as that. As though they were lesser human, they were not citizens. It was also the era of anti-labor, anti-union politics. Big business did not want the unions. They had their own private security forces to make sure to break up the unions. So this was the period also that they were adamantly against dissidents deviating from the two main parties, which at the time, obviously, they still are, were the Republican and Democratic, both serving Wall Street. They differed on some issues, they agreed on others, but both the goals, overall goals, as they are today, they both faithfully served those goals of basically capital accumulation for Wall Street. Now, the new Gilded Age is of dismantling, doing away with federal agencies where affirmative action, where diversity, equity, inclusion were, I should say, no more, the law, that gave the signal, has already given the signal to the private sector across the United States to go along with what the GOP is doing in Washington, what the Republican Party is doing in Washington. Most companies, according to Forbes magazine online, most companies have gone along with what Trump is doing, Trump and Elon Musk are doing. The JP Morgan bank, the largest in the United States and the largest in the world, announced that it was too costly, too much paperwork to bother with enforcing affirmative action, to enforcing equity and inclusion and diversity. It's much cheaper. The implication, the unspoken implication here, it's much cheaper to be a racist, to be a xenophobe, to be a misogynist. I'm not saying they said that at all. But the implication is, if you don't have that, that means we go back to the era of the late 19th century, the original Gilded Age, where a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was at the head of the institutional structure, and there was exclusivity. The others were excluded. They were marginalized. So marginalization is cheaper than inclusion, right? So this is a very serious issue because major corporations have followed suit, and they're not shy about saying it. In fact, they do want the Trump administration to know that, yes, we're going along with ending DEI, as it's called, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, there are companies from Apple to Goldman Sachs to Costco, all for different reasons. Costco, historically a progressive company. The other two are doing it because their workforce is, in fact, very diverse. They have no choice. So there are companies who do not go along with it, but there are very few. The majority go along with the government. And they go along with the government because the government is very important to them, because the government right now is about to introduce a bill that will provide $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, most going to the top 10%, most of that going to the top 1%. So why wouldn't the corporations go along with this? The rewards that the administration uh, offers are lucrative. So this, and this is not to say, by the way, that behind the policy of more tax cuts, as though the United States public debt needs any more burdening, it's already at 37 trillion, 126% of GDP, as though it needs to pile up more, because that's what this is. They don't have the money to buy. You know, the rhetoric about gutting the agencies, the federal agencies, and getting the money out of them is nonsense, because the real goal there, by the way, is to bring in Silicon Valley and bring in high-tech machinery, IA-based, that is artificial intelligence based, and to replace a lot of the human workers with that machinery. That will cost the taxpayer hundreds of billions. Okay, that's one issue. The other issue is they want to create a patronage system in government as existed during the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, there was no merit system in the government bureaucracies. It was based on political patronage. The merit system was introduced during the progressive era from Theodore Roosevelt, elected in 1900. He took office in 1901, all the way to William Howard Taft, who succeeded him. Then, of course, Woodrow Wilson after William Howard Taft. The first two Republicans, Woodrow Wilson, of course, a Democrat. That's when professional, the bureaucracies, the federal bureaucracies became professionalized. That's when the merit system began to be implemented. They brought people who had college degrees, they were educated, they were experts in their field, instead of bringing people who had worked on political campaigns and brought out votes for politicians to be elected. And those politicians, of course, did the bidding of businesses. The Gilded Age created a lot of chaotic conditions within the capitalist class, and I'm afraid the new Gilded Age will do the same thing. The reason that there was a progressive movement is in America is because the disparate interests, the various interests in the capitalist class, struggle for a larger slice of the economic pie, and that's where they differed. Okay, the mining producers and the agriculture producers, the farm producers and the animal husbandry producers versus the railroads that transported all this stuff. If transportation takes a larger cut out of the economic pie because they're not regulated by the government, then that leaves less for the producers, for the sector, for the agricultural sector, the mining sector, the animal husbandry sector, the meat and poultry. So this is an issue that came up, and that is where the regulatory agencies came in. The other one, of course, was safety in food and drugs. By the way, the Trump administration wants to go back to the period before there was safety for food and drugs, especially drugs. They haven't said anything, although they have attacked the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the CDC down in Atlanta, the Center for Disease Control, and they want to gut them too. As much as they have attacked others, but they are going after agencies that deal with public health and with food safety for the American citizens, for the citizens. And this is the sort of situation that existed before the progressive period, and it was made popular by the great American novelist Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, who brought out all this stuff into the open. And even Theodore Roosevelt, who was a Republican. Sinclair, by the way, was a socialist. But Theodore Roosevelt loved Upton Sinclair's work. He agreed with Upton Sinclair's work. One other thing that we have today, which is rather dangerous and startling to a lot of people, and of course a number in the Senate, on the Senate floor as well as on the floor of the House, have gotten up on the floor and made speeches about, is the massive concentration of wealth. And it doesn't really look very good when you have the world's richest men. And in one congressional testimony, one of the congressmen, I forget the name of the congressman, came up and said, okay, here he is going after Social Security recipients whose average is about $65 a day. And his average, his company's average in contracts by the government is 800 million. So you have basically the people who absorb the mass resources of capital, absorb the mass resources of capital from taxpayer money, namely the capitalist class under the neoliberal system, complain about the few dollars that the worker receives for Social Security benefits. They complain about Medicaid. They complain about subsidized housing. They complain about the school lunch program. Those things absorb a small percentage of the US budget of 7 trillion, close to 7 trillion. When you consider that 1 trillion of that, close to 1 trillion of that, is just the defense budget, by the way. Most of that goes to defense contractors. So what we have here is the hypocrisy at its most absurd. And especially when the person doing the accusation, of course, as many senators and congressmen and newspapers have written about this, is the billionaire who has received corporate subsidies and government contracts and tax cuts. In 2017, President Trump, in his first administration, gave back close to $2 trillion in tax cuts to the richest 1%, of which must, of course, these are benefited. These are people, the people who have the most capital and who are about to get even more, because there is a bill that has been considered to cut $4.5 trillion in taxes, and most of that going to the richest 1%. Those are the people that want to attack social welfare because they want the social welfare safety net monies to go to absorb some of the shock. And it's not going to cover it all. That's why the debt ceiling has to be raised, by the way. Money has to be borrowed. They can't pay for this unless they borrow this money from investors, domestic and foreign investors, to give the tax breaks to the wealthiest people. This is the sort of thing that Trump and the people who follow Trump like about the Gilded Age, because during the Gilded Age, there was no income tax. The income tax, the federal income tax, was introduced during the progressive period. In fact, Wilson signed it in 1913. So you don't have, basically, you don't have a progressive tax. You have a regressive tax. That is the mass consumer paying taxes to support the government and whatever the government collects from various other fees, from customs and so forth. But it's consumption tax where they rested. Indirect tax, not the direct tax. The direct tax is the most progressive, especially when it rises in percentages, you go up in income. And that's the one that they are cutting today. In the Eisenhower administration, the rate was 90% on corporations and the top 1%. Today, For the richest people, it's 8%, and for corporations, 21%. But when you figure all the expenses and the deductions, the loopholes that there are in the tax system, some of them pay nothing. These are people who then turn around and get corporate subsidies, bailouts. When there was the crisis, for example, of 2008, the Great Recession, these are the people who get huge government contracts, lucrative contracts. These are the people who enjoy the benefits of a state that really is for them. So the new Gilded Age has indeed a lot of things in common with the old Gilded Age. This is not to argue that history repeats itself like the philosopher George Santayana argues, because it doesn't repeat itself, but the patterns are very similar, that we are back in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. Here we are in the 21st century. And all of this is happening, by the way, at a time. This is happening at a time that the overall status of the US economy in the capitalist world system is in decline as a core country, and about to be replaced within the next 10, 15 years with China as the world's largest economy in GDP nominal value terms. It's already number one in purchasing power parity terms. I want to, since I mentioned the loss of the decline of Pax Americana and the loss of the United States core status in the capitalist world economy, I want to mention in closing the role of the United States in foreign affairs, because obviously foreign policy reflects domestic policy. The Gilded Age had a foreign policy, and it was a foreign policy of preparing for the rise of Pax Americana, laying the foundations for it. Well, today the United States is trying to not to lose Pax Americana in its decline. And the United States role today is, in fact, focused on making sure that its containment policy at the economic, that is geoeconomic and geopolitical level against China especially, but also Russia, and China is really the major issue here, works, because that's the only way the US can retain its status. Obviously, we have seen the results of that so far in the last 30 years. Now, the Trump administration has proceeded with a foreign economic policy that has alienated even its allies. And by allies, I mean everyone, from Canada and Mexico right next door, threatening tariffs and forcing them to make temporary concessions so that Trump doesn't go after them, to Europe, to the European Union, to China, obviously, but also Taiwan, which the US needs as geopolitical leverage to undermine China. And yet Taiwan is also a target. South Korea, Japan, it doesn't matter. The entire world is a target. The defense secretary in February 2025 at the Munich Defense Conference, the defense secretary of Singapore stated that the US has shifted, and I'm paraphrasing, from a country of moral legitimacy and the rule of law to a landlord on this planet seeking rent from the rest of us. There was another article in Newsweek of all. This is not Singapore, this is an American mainstream journal, which basically implied that the US was looking for extortion money. For example, it was revealed by the Telegraph in England, an online newspaper known for its conservative views, that the US basically proposed to Ukraine that it agree to provide half of its mineral wealth to the US. That this is Trump's proposal. That mineral wealth in total is estimated at 15 trillion, so 7.5 trillion will go to the US. In addition to that, the US wanted the ports. The US also wanted 50% of the profits from every time Ukraine signs a contract with a foreign entity on those minerals with a third party, whether it's a company or a government. On top of that, the US did not want Ukraine providing any reconstruction contracts, which are estimated at least $500 billion, by the way, to any entity that did not provide support for Ukraine during the war with Russia. Now, it's interesting that today is the 18th of February. It's interesting that when the talk started yesterday in Saudi Arabia, the two parties at the table were the United States. Well, there was the Saudi foreign minister. I saw him there as well. The two major parties were really the United States and Russia. Ukraine was not invited. Europe was not invited. The European Union, of course, made its views known. The former foreign minister of Belgium on the 17th of February, 2025, stated, and he's no longer the foreign minister, he's a member of the European Parliament. He stated that the United States is not an ally of the European Union. It's not an ally of Europe. It is a member of NATO, but it is not an ally. On the contrary, he pointed out that as far as he and many of his colleagues are concerned, and this is a view, by the way, now widely spreading all over Europe, the United States having excluded Europe from negotiations at the peace table, just like the Europeans, the French and the British excluded Germany at the Peace of Versailles in 1919, by the way. And we know what happened, what the outcome of that was. Anyway, the rise of Hitler 15 years later. The fact is that the European Union was excluded. The European Union has been targeted for economics, for tariffs or punitive tariffs. The European Union has been lectured on by both Musk and the Vice President J.D. Vance for not being tolerant enough toward the far right wing. They're not tolerant enough to the far right. The European Union, for its part, complained that the Trump administration individuals, including J.D. Vance as well as Musk, have interfered in the domestic affairs of the European Union, promoting neo-Nazis in Europe, the far right, like the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, for example, which is neo-Nazi. They're not apologetic about that. But also promoting far-right movements in 24 countries around the world. So the Europeans now have shifted their views about the degree to which the United States, a liberal democracy coming out of the 18th century, shortly before the French Revolution of 1789, that's when the US was born. around the time the two Atlantic revolutions, the American and the French Revolution in the late 18th century, arising out of liberal democracy, the ideals of the Enlightenment, now supporting far right-wing political parties and promoting the regimentation of economic blocs and promoting unilateralism and alienating allies unless they submit to US terms. So even United States mainstream media, some of them, are calling this the policy of intimidation, the policy of extracting favors, the policy of coercion, and not a multilateral policy intended to, inclusive policy intended to work toward reciprocity. So what we have here with the new Gilded Age is an administration that is behaving in foreign affairs against the vast majority of the population, the working class and the middle class, which bear the brunt of these policies that the administration of amassing capital concentration the administration is following. We have basically an equivalent to that in the foreign affairs domain, where the policy, the foreign policy of the United States is designed to take into account only its hegemonic interests, its economic interests, its geopolitical interests, without any account to its partners and allies, and to reduce, blatantly reduce to economic imperialism allies like Ukraine, which of course the previous president obviously encouraged to go to war. He could have said no, he could have struck a deal with Putin, but he didn't, namely Joe Biden, but he did not. The Ukrainians went into this war assuming the US had their back and assuming the Europeans had their back, and now they find out that their patrons want half of their wealth. This is exactly the era of classical imperialism in the late 19th century, in the Gilded Age. This is the era when, because of imperialism, there were what are called in European history wars of imperialism, world history actually, because the United States and Japan were involved in some of those wars of imperialism on a world scale. All of this led to World War I. The question, of course, is this sustainable? I'm going to end with this. Is this sustainable? It is really difficult to argue that it is sustainable because the United States has a long-standing history as an open society, a pluralist society. However, the fact is the United States has been in decline since George Herbert Walker Bush in 1990-91, I believe, declared the United States, declared the new world order, the United States a unipolar power, the only superpower in the world remaining, which it was, and implying the US had just won the Cold War. And American intellectuals, journalists, academics, they all went along with it. Very few disagreed. Except now, in the mid-2020s, we know who really won the Cold War. And the country that won the Cold War is the country that is now in transitioning toward the core of the world capitalist economy, and the country that is heading the BRICS group, namely China, the country that has the economic muscle to build a huge military. It only spends 1/3 of what the US spends, less than a third of what the US spends on defense. But it has the means to challenge the United States at any level because the basis, the foundation of all power is economic. And that economic power rests with China, transitioning to replace Pax Americana in this century. And this started with the end of the Cold War. And the Chinese Beijing watched very closely what happened to Russia, and they were determined not to repeat the mistakes of Boris Yeltsin back in the 1990s. The Gilded Age, I'm afraid, is here to stay. It will get worse unless and maybe if it happens that the elites themselves determine that this is disruptive to the economy, the next time, and to society and to political and social harmony, the next time there is economic contraction, and this is not if there is an economic contraction, it's when there is an economic contraction, because that is inevitable, given that in 500 years, capitalism expands and contracts, expands and contracts. There will be a contracting cycle. And when that one comes, that's when the real test will emerge, whether the United States, as in the Great Depression, will go the route that it did in 1932, electing FDR, who opted for democracy, liberal democracy, under Keynesian economics, namely the New Deal, or whether an inclusive society, or whether it opts toward full-fledged authoritarianism and this nonsense of unitary executive theory that Trump goes on Twitter, on X, rather, it used to be Twitter, and repeats the saying of Napoleon Bonaparte, as though Trump is Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, in the early 19th century, which is absurd in itself. But in any case, such is the situation we're living. All of this has been brought about because of structural elements. This is not about Trump. This is not a cult of personality, although he certainly, and the people around him and the media have certainly tried to make it about the individual. It's not about the individual. It would have been somebody else if it were not for this individual. It's structural elements resulting from the neoliberal political economy. And that's what we're living. This is what brought back the new Gilded Age. I want to thank you for watching. I invite you to send comments, questions, and so forth. And please subscribe to this channel. My very good friend Asad Alim manages this channel. It's educational, and I ask you to please join this channel for more sessions. Thank you very much.